was colder than it looked. A square box of gray walls, a metal table, 2 stiff chairs, and a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Under the harsh fluorescent light, Chris Watts sat alone. His hands were pressed tightly between his knees, fingers interlocking and unlocking as if trying to hold together the last pieces of a reality he knew was collapsing. Every few seconds his eyes moved, toward the door, toward the table, toward some point in space that wouldn't stare back with judgment. He looked like a man waiting for something. Or someone. Detectives had just stepped out moments earlier. They had left him in a pressure cooker of his own thoughts, hoping the silence would work its slow psychological magic. And it did. Chris's chest rose and fell with shallow, jittery breaths, like someone preparing for impact. This was not the confident neighbor who had spoken to cameras just days earlier. This was a man cornered by truth. Outside the room, officers whispered in low, strategic tones. They had a plan. They believed Chris would open up only when he saw a familiar face, one person he still trusted enough to crumble in front of. And so they brought him in. The door clicked. Light footsteps entered. Chris looked up. His father, Ronnie Watts, stepped inside. A soft, exhausted man with worry carved deep into his face, Ronnie walked in slowly, almost cautiously, as if approaching a wounded animal. He sat across from his son. For a moment, neither spoke. There was only the sound of a buzzing light above them, and the distant echo of conversations in the hallway. Then Chris exhaled, a trembling release that came from somewhere buried far beneath the lies he had been clinging to. "Hey, Dad," he said, barely audible. Ronnie leaned forward, searching his son's face for answers, for explanations, for anything that could make sense of the nightmare unfolding outside this room. "Chris, what's going on?" His voice cracked. It was the question every father prays they will never have to ask. Chris swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the door again, then back to his father. The detectives were gone, but their shadows lingered in the air. He knew they were somewhere nearby, waiting, listening. And yet, in front of him sat the one person whose presence could strip him down to the boy he used to be, long before his world turned dark. Ronnie placed a hand flat on the table, steady, patient. "Talk to me, son." Chris looked down at his hands, at the fingers trembling uncontrollably. And then, because fear moves differently in the presence of someone who raised you, he began to talk, but only in broken pieces, fragments of a story that shifted each time he opened his mouth. Before the truth could begin its slow unraveling, the narrator's voice slips through the tension, inviting the audience deeper into this room where secrets were about to claw their way into the open. If you are just joining this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel. What happens in this room will haunt you long after this episode ends. And trust me, you don't want to miss the chapters that follow. Ronnie leaned even closer now, sensing something slipping out from beneath Chris's shaky attempt at control. The father searched his son's eyes, hoping for innocence, praying for anything but guilt. But what he saw there, fear, exhaustion, and a strange resignation, made him inhale sharply. Chris's voice cracked. "Dad. I need to tell you something." The room's temperature seemed to drop again. The words hung there, suspended, heavy, and dangerous. This was the moment detectives had been waiting for, the moment where truth, lies, fear, and guilt collided in a single breath. Chris opened his mouth. And as the final line of this chapter approaches, everything slows, every heartbeat echoing against metal walls. "Dad, something happened." The darkness was ready to speak. Ronnie's breath caught the moment those words slipped out of Chris's mouth. Something happened. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. It lived in that dangerous space between truth and deception, a place where fathers pray their sons will never lead them. Chris rubbed his palms against his jeans, wiping away sweat that only grew thicker with every second. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had shifted a few inches inward, pressing closer, squeezing the truth out of him. Ronnie waited, patient but terrified, leaning forward as if bracing himself for a blow he couldn't see coming. "What do you mean, son?" he asked softly, his voice trembling, desperate for clarity, for any version of a story that didn't end in horror. Chris swallowed hard. His eyes welled, not with sorrow, but with panic, the kind of panic that claws up from the stomach when lies begin to fall apart. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain composure, but the facade he had carefully constructed over the past days had begun to crumble. And sitting across from him, his father could see every crack. Chris whispered, I don't want to protect her anymore." The words slipped out before he could pull them back. Ronnie blinked. Her. The detective's theory suddenly echoed in his mind, the one they dared not say too loudly without proof. He stared at his son, confused, searching his face for meaning. "Who, Chris?" he asked gently. "Who are you talking about?" Chris looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shannon, she hurt the girls." His breath hitched as he tried to continue the lie that had been planted in his mind only minutes earlier by detectives who had pushed him into a corner. I freaked out, Dad." A silence so heavy followed that it pressed on both of them like a weight. Ronnie tilted his head slightly, shock flickering across his face. This wasn't the truth he expected, and yet it wasn't the truth at all. It was the first crack in the dam, the moment when guilt begins to create its own distorted version of reality. Chris lifted his hands, clutching his head, shaking as he muttered, "I didn't know what to do, everything just happened so fast." Ronnie leaned in. "Chris, listen to me," he said, voice steadying despite the storm raging inside him. "You need to tell the truth. Whatever happened, you need to say it. Right now." Chris exhaled shakily. His shoulders slumped. The weight of the last lie he would ever tell sat on him like iron. He looked up at his father, and something inside him broke. There was no escape left. The detectives had pushed. The silence had squeezed. And now, with his father's eyes locked onto his, the unraveling had begun. The narrator's voice slips through the moment, carrying the viewer deeper. If the tension in this room is pulling you in, make sure you like this video, and subscribe to Grave's Secret for more real interrogations and dark psychological breakdowns. What Chris says next will define the rest of this case. Ronnie's hand trembled as he reached out slightly, not quite touching Chris, but close enough that the gesture filled the room with a tragic kind of warmth. "Son, please. Tell me what really happened with Shannon. With the girls. Tell me everything." Chris's face fell. His breathing became uneven. His eyes darted to the door again, then to the table, then back to his father, the only anchor left in a sea of guilt. He bit his lip hard enough that it turned white, the pressure building inside him like a storm ready to burst. Finally, he whispered, "Dad. I saw her, on the monitor, with the girls." Ronnie's eyes widened. And with that fragile, trembling lie hanging between them, the interrogation room braced itself. Because what came next would shatter whatever remained of the world they thought they knew. The room seemed to hold its breath as Chris whispered those words, his voice thin and frayed. I saw her, on the monitor, with the girls. It was a lie born out of panic, desperation, and the collapse of every excuse he had rehearsed since the moment his world fell apart. Ronnie stared at his son, searching for some hint of misunderstanding, some clue that this wasn't the devastating implication it sounded like. But Chris avoided his gaze, looking down at his lap as if the truth was carved into the crease of his jeans. Ronnie's voice shook. Chris, what are you saying exactly? He didn't want to push too hard, but he also knew this was the moment everything hinged on. The weight of a father's fear pressed into his words, soft but urgent. Chris rubbed his forehead, fingers digging into his temples as though trying to massage clarity into a story that didn't make sense even to him. I saw something on the baby monitor, he repeated, his voice cracking. The girls, they weren't moving. Ronnie leaned in, confusion turning into disbelief. He didn't know what to believe anymore, his son's trembling voice or the nightmare unfolding in the world outside this small room. Chris, tell me straight. What happened to Shannon? What happened to the kids? Chris stared at the table, tears gathering but refusing to fall. She hurt them. The lie became heavier with each repetition, sinking into the air like fog. She did something, to the girls. And I just reacted. Ronnie recoiled slightly. His jaw tightened, disbelief flickering across his face. The story didn't fit. Nothing aligned. Chris's words felt like pieces forced into the wrong places of a puzzle. Son, Ronnie whispered, this doesn't sound right. You loved those girls more than anything. Shannon loved them. Nothing about this makes sense. For the first time since he entered the room, Ronnie's voice carried a firmness, a father stepping out of shock and into reality. Chris's shoulders slumped even more. His breathing grew shallow. He looked like a man drowning while sitting perfectly still. Outside the room, detectives watched through the glass. They had seen lies crumble before, but this was different. This was a man coming face to face with the last person he ever expected to lie to, his own father. And the pressure was beginning to break his resolve. Chris squeezed his eyes shut. I didn't know what to do, he whispered. I just lost it. Ronnie rubbed his forehead, pain etched into every line of his face. Chris, you need to tell the truth. This story, it isn't making sense. Please, son, you gotta be honest. Right now. The tension in the room swelled like a heartbeat, pounding through the silence. The viewer can feel it, the emotional weight pressing deeper. And through this darkness, the narrator's voice materializes softly. Before this moment turns even darker, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Grave's Secret. This is the interrogation that shattered the nation, and it only gets more chilling from here. Chris inhaled sharply, his chest rising in a painful arc. The lie he just told was collapsing, folding under its own weight. His face twisted, guilt, fear, and unbearable pressure converging all at once. He ran his hands through his hair, gripping tightly as though trying to pull himself back from the edge. Finally, he looked up at his father, eyes red, voice cracking apart completely. Dad! I can't keep lying. Ronnie froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The shift in Chris's tone was unmistakable. This wasn't the voice of a man defending himself anymore. This was the voice of a man about to confess. What really happened, Chris? Chris swallowed hard. His lips parted. Dad, it was me." The words hovered in the air, heavy, unmistakable, irreversible. And just like that, the mask began to fall. The words barely left Chris's mouth before the room seemed to change. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Ronnie felt it immediately, a shift in air pressure, a tightening of space, as if the walls leaned closer to hear the truth that had been hiding behind every trembling breath. "Dad, it was me." For words capable of shattering an entire world. Ronnie didn't move at first. He just stared at his son as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. His eyes widened slightly, searching for some sign that he had misheard, that he had misunderstood, that maybe this was still part of some horrible, tangled explanation. But Chris wasn't looking away anymore. His eyes were locked onto his father's, and the collapse of his soul was written right there in them. What do you mean, son?" Ronnie whispered, barely audible. Chris's fingers twisted together on the table, knuckles turning white. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, as if afraid the walls themselves might judge him. I did it," he said, his voice breaking mid-sentence. "It wasn't Shannon. It was me. I hurt them." For a moment, Ronnie's expression froze in place, part disbelief, part heartbreak, part numbness. He blinked slowly, swallowing hard, fighting against a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly bowed his shoulders forward. He had come in hoping to comfort his son, to make sense of confusion. Instead, he was hearing the most devastating truth a father could ever absorb. Chris looked down again, tears clinging to the edges of his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words snagged in his throat. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he whispered. "It all happened so fast." Ronnie placed a trembling hand over his mouth, staring at his son in stunned silence. His heart pounded with a sickening heaviness. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how. Those questions lived somewhere far beyond the reach of this moment. All he could do was listen as Chris began to unravel the reality he'd been hiding since the morning it happened. Chris wiped his face with both hands, breathing shakily. "I don't know what came over me," he murmured. One moment everything was fine, and the next, he shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Guilt gnawed through his voice, twisting every word. Ronnie's voice finally returned, fragile but steady. "Son, you have to tell the detectives the truth. Everything. You can't hold anything back now." He looked around the room, then back at Chris. "They need to know what really happened." Chris nodded weakly, though fear clung to him like a second skin. He exhaled, a deep, broken breath, and pressed his palms against the table, grounding himself. This was the moment that detectives had been waiting for. The moment when the dam finally cracked wide open. The narrator's voice slips gently into the tension, guiding the viewer deeper into the unfolding tragedy. If you're still with us in this haunting moment, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Grave Secret. The truth Chris reveals in this chapter reshaped an entire investigation. Outside the room, detectives were already moving. They had been listening. Watching. Waiting for this fracture in the facade. Now they returned, opening the door slowly, stepping inside with careful, deliberate movements. Their eyes flicked between father and son, reading the raw emotion hanging in the air. Chris didn't look up. Ronnie did. And the look he gave them was one of a father whose world had been rewritten in a single sentence. The detective sat down. The tape recorder clicked back on. And as Chris finally lifted his head, fear and resignation filling his eyes, He whispered the beginning of a confession that would stain the walls of that room forever. The detectives eased into their chairs with the quiet precision of people who knew the gravity of what had just occurred. They didn't need to pressure him anymore. Chris's shoulders were slumped, his breaths uneven, his eyes red and unfocused. The truth had already cracked through him, and now all that was left was to let the confession bleed out slowly, painfully, into the room. Ronnie sat beside him, silent but present, a father who had just witnessed the unraveling of the boy he once held in his arms. One detective leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Chris, earlier you said something to your dad. We need you to walk us through it. We need you to tell us exactly what happened." Chris swallowed hard. He didn't look at the detectives. He didn't look at his father. His gaze stayed fixed on the table, on some invisible point that seemed safer than the faces staring back at him. I messed up," he whispered. "I ruined everything." The room stayed still, waiting. Chris's voice trembled as he continued. "When Shannon got home, we started talking. Arguing." He paused, blinking back fresh tears. "I don't know what came over me. I felt like everything was slipping away." Ronnie closed his eyes for a moment, pain washing across his face. Hearing his son say these things was like being struck repeatedly in the same wound. But he didn't interrupt. Chris's words came out in fragments now, broken pieces of a truth that was as horrifying as it was inevitable. I did something I can't take back. I hurt her." His voice cracked. "And then, the girls, they saw." The detectives didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched him, letting the details surface one agonizing breath at a time. "I don't know what I was thinking," Chris whispered. "I wasn't thinking. I panicked. And after that, everything spiraled." Tears finally slipped down his face, quiet and uncontrolled. The confession was no longer something he could hold back. It had become a living thing, pushing its way out of him, forcing him to confront what he had done even as he tried to disconnect from his own words. Ronnie reached out and gently touched his son's arm, the touch barely there, but enough to break something inside Chris. He inhaled sharply, chest tightening, a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. His father's presence, steady, familiar, heartbreaking, was the final thread tethering him to the boy he used to be. But the man sitting in this chair was someone else now, someone even he didn't recognize. The detective spoke softly. "Chris, we need you to be completely honest. Your family deserves that. And you deserve that." Chris nodded slowly, defeated. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The camera in the corner blinked quietly, capturing every second, every tear, every crack in his voice. Outside, the world was already shifting. Reporters gathered, neighbors whispered, and an entire nation waited for answers. Inside this room, those answers were being born in the most painful way imaginable. And as the confession settled over the room like a shadow, the narrator's voice guides the viewer through the final moments. If you followed this story to this point, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Grave Secret. The truth revealed here changed everything, from the investigation to the courtroom, to the way the world viewed the man who once pretended to be a grieving father. The detectives finally stood. They thanked Chris for his honesty, though every word felt heavy, almost mournful. Ronnie sat frozen, his hand still resting on his son's arm, as if letting go would make the nightmare more real. Chris leaned back in his chair, his face hollow, his body shaking with the weight of everything he had confessed. The officers moved toward him slowly, gently, as the door opened to escort him out. The moment felt endless, a walk toward the life he had chosen, a path that would never again see freedom or forgiveness. As the door closed, the room fell silent. And the world outside would never forget what happened inside.